Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Random House Summer Reads. This is the final event in our virtual Random House Summer Read series, and we are so excited for tonight's conversation on our favorite topic, discovering fantastic books. I am honored to introduce our moderator for this evening, Abbe Wright. Abbe Wright is the senior editor of Read It Forward, an online book vertical that helps readers discover exciting new books and classic reads. Previously, she was a contributing editor at Glamour and an assistant editor at O, the Oprah magazine, where she contributed to the Reading Room and Live Your Best Life sections and worked on Oprah's Book Club 2.0. She has also written for The Cut, Metro, Modern Bride, Elegant Bride, and Philadelphia Magazine. She earned a BA in English from Denison University in Granville, Ohio. She was raised outside of Philadelphia and lives in Brooklyn, New York. And now, may I present Abbe Wright and Random House Summer Reads.
Hi, I'm Abby. It's so good to be with all of you tonight. Thank you so much for coming. And today was a beautiful day in New York, so I'm happy we're still calling it summer. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to the authors we have with us tonight. First up is Yiyun Li. She is the author of 6 works of fiction: Must I Go, Where Reasons End, Kinder Than Solitude, 1,000 Years of Good Prayers, The Vagrants, and Gold Boy, Emerald Girl, and the memoir, Dear Friend, From My Life, I Write to You in Your Life. She is the recipient of many awards, including a PEN Hemingway Award, a PEN Gene Stein Book Award, a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, and a Wyndham Campbell Prize, and was featured in the New Yorker's 20 Under 40 fiction issue. She teaches at Princeton University and lives in Princeton, New Jersey. Hi, Yiyun.
Hi, Abby.
Next up, we have Gabriella Burnham, who is a dual citizen of the United States and Brazil. Now a New York resident, she lived in São Paulo as a child, and most of her family still lives there today. She holds an MFA in creative writing from the Writers' Foundry at St. Joseph's College. She has worked as a reporter, a creative writing teacher, and in immigration law. Gabriella's writing has appeared in the Battersea Review, Nantucket Today, The Inquirer and Mirror, and The Attic. It Is Wood, It Is Stone is her first novel. Welcome, Gabriella.
Thank you so much.
Next up, we have Sanaë Lemoine. Sanaë was born in Paris to a Japanese mother and French father, and raised in France and Australia. She earned her undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania and her MFA at Columbia University. She now lives in New York. The Margot Affair is her first novel. Welcome, Sanaë.
Hi, Abby.
And finally, we have Regina Porter. Regina is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she was an Iowa Arts Fellow and recipient of a 2017-2018 Ray Armour West Postgraduate Scholarship. She is also a 2017 Tin House Summer Workshop Scholar. Her fiction has been published in the Harvard Review. An award-winning writer with a background in playwriting, Porter has worked with Playwrights Horizons, the Joseph Papp Theater, New York Stage and Film, the Women's Project, Woolly Mammoth Theater Company, and Horizon Theater Company. She has been anthologized in Plays from Woolly Mammoth by Broadway Play Services and Heinemann's Scenes for Women by Women. She has also been profiled in Southern Women Playwrights, New Essays in History and Criticism from the University of Alabama Press. Porter was born in Savannah, Georgia, and lives in Brooklyn. Welcome, Regina.
Hello. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Well, I would love to start with just a brief synopsis of your books. And I'd like to go in reverse order from the way I just introduced you. So Regina, would you kick us off with an elevator pitch? What's your novel, The Travelers, all about?
Well, The Travelers is about two families There's a patriarch, the man James Vincent. He is Irish American. And there's an African American matriarch. She is from Georgia, and her name is Agnes Miller. And it's about their two families, their lives, and how they intersect against the backdrop of history from the 1950s to Obama's first year as president. We track their love lives, the intersection of their children's lives. John, the man Vincent's son Rufus marries Agnes Miller's daughter. They're both scholars and professors. And so that's it, yes.
Thank you, Regina. Sanaë, let's hear from you. Tell us about the Margot Affair.
Yeah, the Margot Affair is set in Paris, and it's about 17-year-old Margot, who is the hidden daughter of an affair between a politician and an actress. And she yearns for her father's legal recognition. And the summer before her last year of high school, she makes the impulsive decision to tell a journalist about her family's identity. And the novel takes place in the aftermath of this reveal.
Dun, dun, dun. Gabriella, let's hear from you. Tell us about It Is Wood, It Is Stone.
So It Is Wood, It Is Stone is about a woman named Linda who is reckoning with what it is that she desires from her life. So in the opening of the book, she realizes that everything that she knows about herself has been eclipsed by her husband's ambitions. So she thinks she wants to leave him, but then he comes home one day and says, I have this great opportunity to go teach at the University of São Paulo for a year in Brazil. So she decides, instead of telling him how she's feeling, she'll go to Brazil and all will be resolved. But they go to Brazil and all is not resolved, so.
Spoiler alert, right? So Yiyun, you have many novels, but I want to hear about your most recent one called Must I Go?
Yeah, so Must I Go is about this 81-year-old woman who has raised many children, grandchildren, and one great-grandchild. And at this moment, she is also widowed 3 times. So she has gone through a lot. And when the novel opens, she's reading an ex-lover's diary in which she was a footnote. So the novel is really about the footnote getting hold of the book and retelling her own story, the footnote story. So she annotated her lover's diary in which she revealed this long buried secret of a child she had with this lover. So that's just a dialogue between an old woman and her dead lover.
Well, I want to hear about the process of distilling your books down to those few sentences. When you are so intimately connected with every sentence, with every word in your books, is it very difficult to smush it into an elevator pitch? Gabriella.
Yes. It is, I will say it's an ongoing process for me. I think I describe my book differently every time I describe it. But maybe that's because it just came out. I'm still working on it. But it's so difficult. It's really the hardest thing. And I think every writer says that, and it's absolutely true. I think mostly because I don't think of my book in terms of the plot details. And so what I want to say is like, it's about how our bodies betray us. It's about the contradictory nature of humans. But a lot of people look at you kind of cross-eyed if you say that. So, yeah.
They're like, oh, you want to know what happens? Oh, okay.
Yeah, right.
Regina, do you struggle with this too?
Oh, yes, I do. And I think sometimes it's because I have different relationships with different characters at different times. So from the time I wrote it to now, the favorites switch, the ones that I sort of had antagonisms with in writing switch. And so it's still this process of learning. And so to kind of give like a concise log line becomes challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Sanaë, I want to hear from you. What was your editing process like? This is your first novel. Was it extensive? Walk us a little bit through that.
Yeah, it feels like it was very extensive. It was a long journey that started in early 2012 with a chapter that was really more of a story than the beginning of a novel. And then the book went through several iterations before I even sent it out to agents and felt that it was somewhat finished. And then I discovered that it needed another 2 years of really deep, what I think of as radical revision, putting aside the draft and writing it from scratch, removing characters completely, changing the structure several times. The structure and the plot were trickiest for me. And the final iteration of the novel is actually its simplest possible version. It's chronological. There are stories embedded within and some flashbacks, but it's mostly a pretty straightforward story. But the way that I wrote it for several years was so circuitous. And so it's been interesting to see that it landed where it did.
And do you think it needed to go through all of those iterations to get to that final point?
Yeah, I think what happened, well, I hope what happened is that I was learning how to write a novel and how to structure it. I remember in graduate school, a teacher telling us that we were mostly writing interconnected short stories, and that really stuck with me, of how to move away from just episodes that are loosely connected to a novel that really has tension and momentum, which doesn't necessarily mean plot in the traditional sense, but a cause and effect throughout. And so that took a really long time to figure out what were the central moments of emotion or change, and what were the effects of each important moment.
Mm-hmm. Yiyun, I want to hear from you too about your editing process, and also how you squeezed it into just being a professor at Princeton as well.
Yes, so my editing, the thing about writing I really love is revision and editing. You know, I think once you have a chunk, 500 pages, for instance, for this novel that I just finished, you have that, you know, I was in Iowa for 9 years, and I don't know if you know, in Iowa state fair, there used to be a butter lady who would do these butter sculpture with butter. But the funny thing is, she had to churn her own butter. She could not just buy butter. So I think the first round, or the first draft, or earlier drafts, for me is just my churning my own butter. But the final revision and editing is just to do that sculpture. So that's the fun part, and it has to do a lot with arranging stuff, moving text around. It's so. I think with the 500 pages, with all those butter, 500 pounds butter, it's so much fun. It's much easier. And being a professor and teaching writing and writing, people say teaching writing and writing, they use the same part of your brain. It does, but I think my goal, or my schedule is, I always write in the morning. I make sure I write before I do everything else. So I think that's the only time I can get.
Mm. Well, speaking of rituals like that, do any of you have any other routines or rituals that you really prefer to stick to when you're writing?
Part of my writing, actually, someone once said that sometimes when you're not writing, you're writing like going to the grocery store, or you have these other rituals. Walking the dog is part of my ritual with writing. And it's so funny. I attended Iowa, and I realized at one point after I left that I would go and do laundry 3 times a day. And I had filled in the schedule that I had for like walking the dog. And my and my friends thought you're crazy, but I was repeating a ritual, and so that's one of those rituals. I think it helps me sit down and just get in a state of mind to write. And like Ms. Lee, I write often in the morning because I find by the time afternoon comes, I'm too critical. The world has invaded that writing space too much, and I can't hear the characters. I can't see the characters. My attention is torn with daily living. Yeah. So.
Can I just add to that? I agree with Regina. I don't read news before I write, because once you see the news, once you see what's going on in the world, it's a lot of noises there.
That's really good advice. I'm writing that down.
What about you, Gabriella? Any, snacks or pens that you need? Any sort of, superstitions that you have while writing?
I try not to get too attached to any rituals, because then if I don't have the ritual, I can't write. Like if I'm not in the space that I need to be in or anything, or if I don't have my favorite mug, then it's like I can't write. But I do, I write by hand for stowaways, and I get a lot of pleasure picking out the notebook that I'm going to have next. And so I guess that would be my little ritual or favorite thing that I like to have, picking out the color of the next moleskin.
Yeah. What was the color for It Is Wood, It Is Stone?
Oh, there were many moleskins for It Is What It Is Stone. There was a navy, I actually still have the navy blue one right here. I had a white one. I had a sage green one that actually made it in the book. I mention a sage green notebook in it. And now I have this really beautiful lavender one.
Oh, I love that. Sanaë, what about you? Any rituals or routines you practiced?
Yeah, the only ritual that I'm just thinking about now is that I also usually begin writing by hand, but I really have to write on this specific paper and with a fountain pen. It's just a disposable cheap fountain pen. I buy them 10 at a time. But the paper is a paper that I would write all my exams on in high school in France. And it's like, I have so many bad memories from that time of my life, but it's like something that I can't shake off. And it has these really small lines so that your writing is kind of, has to fit in these little lines, but I ignore the lines and just write all over. So maybe there's some freedom there.
I love that. Okay, one of our audience members, Marta, asked, how many hours a day do you spend reading? Of course, you're all writers, but do you engage in reading books while you're writing? How do you fit that into your schedule? Or do you have to put books aside while you're working on your own things?
I'll go ahead because I'm such a nerd. Speaking of ritual, I have to, I usually have to have 6 or 7 books I read at the same time, and sometimes 8 books. And I would usually time the timer. I would spend half an hour per book. So if I read 8 books, it takes 4 hours. Not 4 straight hours here, but so that feels to me like a good day if I can go through 8 books, half an hour per book.
I love that. Okay, next one. What about you?
I know, I think my reading has changed some. I did not used to read a lot of nonfiction or history, and I find when I'm writing fiction more, I mix it up, and I read fiction, I read nonfiction articles. I get obsessed with certain things like cleanliness, and and I'll start reading about the history of cleanliness, or yes. And I usually read in the afternoon for the same reason that I write in the morning. I need that separation, and I need the world not to come in quite too much, because the world is very visual for me. So the characters will start walking off the page toward me in a weird way. And so I need that kind of separation. Yeah.
I think when I'm drafting, churning the butter, as Yiyun said, I consume so much, like I want to read everything, and I'm reading like 8 books at once, and I can't get enough. And then something happens to my brain when I'm editing where I think, while I'm reading other fiction, I start to edit while I'm reading their books. And it kind of like, not that it's bad, but the pleasure of just enjoying the book kind of is curbed a bit. So, but same as Regina, I love to read nonfiction too when I'm writing fiction, and kind of following different rabbit holes that might relate to something that you're writing or working on.
Yeah, I think I'm reading almost every day, but I've noticed that when I'm writing, or when I'm really deep in the middle of something, I am such a slow reader. I mean, sometimes it's just a couple of pages in the morning, but maybe it's because I'm kind of taking more pleasure, or thinking about language in a more intense or precise way than when I'm not in the middle of the drafting process. And so there's like this need to really swim in each page and sentence, as opposed to just like going through a book for the pleasure of the story.
Okay, well, speaking of reading, I want you to turn your brains back into the heat of the summer. What were some of the books that you loved reading this summer, or do you have any sort of classic summer reads that feel like the quintessential thing to pack in a beach bag that honestly would be great to read all year round? Regina, let's start with you.
Well, I'm gonna admit, I have a guilty pleasure. I remember my daughter once said, and it was very important to hear my older daughter, Gabby. She said, sometimes it's good to read bad fiction, and that kind of stayed with me in terms of our idea of high and low fiction. And there's a writer, Jacqueline Suzanne, Valley of the Dolls. She's a guilty pleasure. She's an obsession. I'm amazed. I have this thing with like bad films too, I think, and I don't want to say that she was a bad writer, because she was important in a certain way. She was a fun writer, and so that's someone I associate with summer, because I would drop her work. I was not supposed to be reading them into a bag when my parents weren't listening or weren't looking, or my poor father, we were in the grocery store, and I would slide it down the carousel, and so I have fond memories of that. But what I'm loving, and I'm reading very slowly, is Hilary Mantel's book that kind of has taken me through the summer, because I love knowing how Cromwell is going to die, but her still just bringing him to life, I think, against the backdrop of history. The whole trilogy has been fascinating to me. And yes, and also Brett Bennett's The Vanishing Half, because again, I love the old, some of the old films, like An Imitation of Life and A Portrait of Jenny, and this idea of twins and ourselves being reflected at us is kind of fascinating to me. So I'm really enjoying that. And I'm reading it slowly. It's like I don't want summer to end, you know? Yes.
Well, I think we all feel you on that. Yiyun, what about you? What was What are some titles you enjoyed this summer or of summers past?
Of summers past. I always read Moby Dick in the summer, and it turned out to be such a great book this summer because I have been indoors the whole time, and that's one book that takes you out to the world, to the ocean, and it feels very expensive, this time when I read it. And this past summer, I also read, I've read a few really great books, and one of them I just finished is True Grit, Charles Porter.
Mm-hmm.
The funny thing is I would never have thought about reading it. The book is actually such a fun book, and of course it was made into movies twice. I have never seen either production, and just going in not knowing what the book is about, and it turned out to have this really great 14-year-old girl, Mattie Ross, was this really great voice, confident, irreverent, irrelevant. It was a great read.
Oh, Sanaë, what about you?
Yeah, I just finished a book that I can't shake off called True Story by Kate Reed Petty. It came out in August, and I read it in a couple of days. I was just talking about reading slowly, but that one I couldn't. I tried to slow down my reading, but I was just so gripped from the first page. And it's a really clever book because the author draws from the horror genre. And which I love. I mean, I always watch horror movies like with one eye shut and one eye open, but with so much pleasure. And there were chapters that were truly frightening in the book, and it was just fun to experience that in the form of writing. And then I also really enjoyed Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami. Which I read earlier this summer, and there's a lot of talk about sweating and skin and pores, and that felt so fitting. I was in DC and it was incredibly humid and hot, and so I felt like the book was reflecting my life in a sense.
I love that. Gabriella?
So I've been reading a lot of naturalist writing this summer, both I think because I've been trying to get into nature, as a lot of us have, being in quarantine in the city. I'm in the middle of Vesper Flights right now by Helen MacDonald, and it is absolutely stunning. It's so great to read essays too. I think that's really good for summertime because you kind of can read one and then put it down and pick up a new story. But it's so great. I also read Rachel Carson, The Edge of the Sea. And the Sea Around Us too, which, wow, she describes Earth and the creation of creatures in the most literary way. It's incredible. I read Parakeet, Marie-Hélène Bertino's book. That was so great. She's plays with sentences in the most beautiful way. So yeah, I read a lot of great books this summer. There's so many books that came out. I'm also reading Transcendent Kingdom right now, which is really great. Phenomenal. So yeah.
I love that. Okay, so now I want to look ahead to the future and what is on your TBR pile or to be read pile. I want to know what books are on it, and also how you keep track of the books you want to read. Is that something that you do like me, which is just a stack in the corner that's about to fall over? Or do you use a notebook? I want to hear. Sanaë?
Oh, no, I would love to hear your advice from all the others, because I can't believe I haven't found a system to keep track of what I've read and what I'm going to read. It's mostly just piles of books around the apartment and just trying to remember. But I don't read a lot of nonfiction, and right now I do have a stack of books on Argentina and its history that I'm planning to work my way through, and we'll see how that goes. I might just jump back to fiction halfway through.
Regina, what about you? What is on your TBR pile and how do you keep track of it?
Well, I love the nonfiction book, The Warmth of Other Suns, and Miss Wilkerson has a new book out, and so I'm really looking forward to reading that. I have it. I have uh, uh, I'm looking forward to receiving a friend's galley, Donnie Walton. And so I'm looking forward to reading her work. How do I track things? I miss the process of going oftentimes to a bookstore and literally just touching books and running my hands along the covers and then opening them and discovering them. That's oftentimes how I would choose a book. And so sometimes I do that at home, and I also rediscover books. So yeah, and also I have a list of them, like some of them lined up here that I want to read. I keep some. I'm actually doing the Zoom in my bedroom, so I have like maybe 7 or 8 books that I intend to get to, but in no particular order. And so I might just run my hands along them, open them, read a paragraph, and see how I feel that day. Yeah. Mm.
Gabriella, what about you?
I have so many books on my to be read list, which is not a list, it's just stacks everywhere. I really, really, really want to read The Lying Life of Adults, Elena Ferrante. I actually almost just like scrapped everything I was reading just to run to her. But then I just couldn't do it because I have so many books that I'm halfway through. But I have been known to like read a book halfway through and then it gets lost in a stack and then I see it and I'm like, oh my God, I forgot that I read half of that book, and then I'll pick it up again. So yeah, I am getting so many tips from this conversation that I should keep a list of the books that I'm reading. That's such a good idea.
And Yiyun, what about you?
It's very hard to keep a list. I agree. I just counted. I probably have 80 books on my desk, or I have a big dinner table to work on. So I have 80 books here. So I'm just thinking, yeah, I don't have a system. I don't have a list, but I know what I'm going to read. I'm going to reread Sarah Bynum's new collection, Likes. It's such a beautiful, I read it in the e-file on the galley when I blurbed the book. It was such a beautiful collection, and I can't wait to just open the page and read on the page, on the paper. And what else? I have some gardening books. This is the pandemic, turned into a gardener. So I'm reading two ladies' correspondence about how to garden, and it's wonderful. So what else? I mean, just a lot of rereading in the fall. I think my whole life is run around this academic schedule. So once September hits, I'm going to start, to be really reading seriously. So mostly rereading.
Well, that's a great question. One of our members, Erin, who's on the call right now, she asked that now that summer is coming to an end, do you have any fall favorites that you return to every season? And it sounds like you do. You're a rereader in the fall.
I read Giovanni's Room because I teach it James Baldwin, I teach it every semester. So in the fall, at the beginning of the fall, at the beginning of the spring, I always reread Giovanni's Room. And what else? I read Chekhov's short stories mostly in the fall. Again, it's just for teaching, and a lot of classics in the fall.
Yeah, it's like the literary equivalent of comfort food.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Regina, what about you? Is there anything that when the seasons get colder, you find yourself turning to again and again?
I do go back to Great Gatsby because of the chorus and how the chorus functions. The party scenes, and then the overlap, say, that you might have in the chorus in Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And you also see the chorus in Toni Morrison's work. So I'm interested in the chorus and the narrative power of using chorus. So I find like I go back to those books. I hadn't really thought about that, but it's true. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The seasonship. There's a comfort to them in a way.
I love that. Sanaë, what about you? Are there things that you go back to in different months, especially in the fall?
I'd never thought of it in terms of the seasons, but I have noticed that now I feel an impulse to reread. In the summer, I was reading a lot of new books that had been published, a lot of debut novels. But now I just picked up a book that I love and that I read a few years ago, Ishiguro's first book, A Pale View of Hills. And I remember really loving the way that he weaves these two timelines and the way that he writes about trauma in Japan during the post-war years. And so there is like this familiarity, but it's been a couple of years, so it also feels really new, which is such a wonderful experience.
Gabriella, what about you?
I really return to poetry more than I return to novels. I return to novels if I want to reference something because of something that I'm writing. I'm like, oh yeah, that book did it really well. Let me check it out. But for inspiration or comfort or just to fill my heart, I return to poetry. There's one poem, particularly Greg Pardlow's, written by himself. If I need like a kick of inspiration, I'll go back to that. Digest is his collection. But Frank O'Hara, Louise Glick, Anne Carson. There's a book, Cain by Jean Toomer, that is like little vignettes, but also poetry. I'll go back to that just to feel revived by language.
Well, so I want to continue looking ahead to the future and ask you if you can share, what are you working on next, or are there projects that are sort of taking shape for you as you think about the end of this year and the beginning of next? Yiyun, let's start with you.
Yes, shall we be very superstitious about what we're working on? I am, almost towards the end of the first draft of a novel, and it's very hard to talk about what the novel is about, especially if you haven't finished it.
Yes, I completely understand.
I would say what's surprising to me is I wrote this draft during the pandemic. There was I think the pandemic, maybe, I'm sure a lot of writers would feel this way. It's just, I don't know if others feel this way. It changes how your mind works when you write. And there's a certain amount of pressure. And there's also a certain amount of, freedom. Because, what do I do every day? I'm sitting here. So I think I cannot really talk about what the novel is about. I just feel like this is a new experience for me, writing a book without it seems like I'm writing a book without a map, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, actually, that's a great way to reshape the question, which is, how has it been creating art during the pandemic? Have you been able to write? Are you writing without a map, or does it feel like you've been given the gift of time? Gabriella, what about you? Are you working on anything? Are you able to work?
I am. And it's whether I'm able to work or not changes sometimes day by day, sometimes hour by hour. So I guess that's, there have been moments in quarantine where I'm like, this is amazing. I never want to leave my apartment again. Let me just write and, have a cup of coffee and come back in a robe all day. And then other times I'm like, I need someone to tell me what to do. But yeah, I'm working on a novel, and it's set on an island off the coast of Cape Cod that's very closely based off of the island where I grew up, Nantucket. And it has a lot to do with family and sisterhood, but also about climate. So, it's in some ways the quarantine and the incubation that is quarantine and having to sit and reflect on everything that's happening in the world is informing some of what I'm writing, which has been interesting, which I didn't expect. And that's something that quarantine has brought to my writing, and this moment in time has brought to my writing.
Mm-hmm. Regina, what about you? What has the current time brought to your writing?
Well, I think I had a kind of a trajectory for a book that I wanted to write, and I think the pandemic came along and sort of sent me in a completely new and different direction. And as far as where it's going, I think, and it's something I try to tell students, that even if you have a sense of the plot, you don't often know where it's going. For me, it's writing is so character based, and so I basically just try to follow the characters. And right now it's still early going, so I have to see where the character leads me. But certainly the pandemic has influenced where I'm going right now, and I kind of fought it, but it kind of took over, and there you have it. So,
Sanaë, what about you?
Yeah, I love what Regina said about following the characters, because that's also how I write. And I think during the pandemic, because my first novel came out in June, that period was difficult for me to write. And I felt like I was also separating myself from the first book. Still thinking about it a lot, but moving away from that world and starting to follow the characters of a new novel, which I had started working on last year and set aside and have picked up again. But it feels so different from my first book in scope, and it's a lot more sprawling. It takes place over 15 years in Japan and Argentina, and whereas the Margot Affair takes place over 1 year in one place with a very young narrator. So it's exciting to be in a different space and just like taking the adventure of it, but also a bit nerve-wracking at times, because I truly don't know where it's going, and it's branching off in 20 different directions.
But the writer in you wants to travel, so now I want to turn it over to some excellent questions from our audience. So these are for all of you. Jump in if you feel compelled, but no, not everyone needs to answer. But Sonia asked, what are some writers and other creatives that have informed your writing craft?
well, I'll start. One of them is here, Miss Lee. I had the pleasure of hearing you honor James Allen McPherson a few years ago, and he was one of the reasons I went to Iowa. And so I think there's certain writers who raise the bar high for other writers in a wonderful way that can be thrilling, and some of them we forget about. He's, I think, just a superb writer, and I think you picked up that torch and carried it. So I want to just stop and acknowledge someone who's in the room.
That's very kind of you, Regina.
Yes.
Well, I would actually add, I have been reading James Allen McPherson just these days, because I'm planning to record one of his pieces for 92nd Street Y podcast. And, as Regina said, James was my mentor in Iowa. And I think he really, his work and his view of the world shaped me as a writer. So I would really credit him as one of the biggest influences.
This is such a difficult question, because my mind starts shooting to so many different writers. But Clarice Lispector is definitely a writer that when I first read her, I felt like I had been like broken open in a way that I never had been before, that I, in some ways, was like, she has done everything that I want to do. So maybe I should just stop. But then also was like, I have to continue, I have to be inspired by her to continue, even if just a small part of what she left. So yeah, she's one definitely that I point to. But also I think Gabriel Garcia Marquez was a really early influence of mine, and poets too, all the poets that I named.
I feel like I can't, my mind is also going in all different directions, and it's hard to even just pick a few. But kind of in a more general way, I found myself reading a lot more in French as I was working on my first book, because it is set in France, and I wanted to think about, especially in the dialogue or even in the non-dialogue, how to imbue the language with some of the spirit of French language without it feeling, alienating or like a translation. And I wasn't translating in my mind as I was writing, but I think just reading in another language and having that open up possibilities was inspiring throughout.
So this is a question from Rana, and I think it's just a superb question. So I would love to hear from all four of you. She asks, when you were writing your book, would you share a moment when you got really excited? It could be anything from the writing process to the journey of getting it published, but what were some goosebumps-inducing moments, or just ones that made you really giddy or totally gleeful? Regina, let's start with you.
Talking about following the character is a wonderful example for me, and how much intuition does matter in writing. I had spent the day the morning writing this one scene, and I decided to have this character, Barbara, come from Milwaukee. And I thought, why Milwaukee? I don't know anything about Milwaukee. Well, I'm just going to leave it for now. I'm going to leave it. And my dear friend Deshaun Winslow and I were going to a thrift shop, and I can be very thrifty. And I said, I'm going to get 4 glasses, and they're going to be $4, and that's it. And so we go to this thrift shop in Iowa, and I'm standing in the aisle, and I see 4 bear glasses, and they say Milwaukee. And I say, would you come here, please? This happened so much when I was working on this novel. I would say, oh, I don't know, it can't be. And it would be like a signpost. Literally, you're right, you're going in the right direction. Doesn't matter, you're taking the characters in the right direction. And sometimes it was terrifying to trust it, but it was also thrilling, because it's giving over a certain amount of power to reclaim power and discover power in a way. The power of the characters, they have their lives that are sometimes different from where we want to take them. So yeah.
I love that. Sanaë, what about you?
If I had to choose one, it was actually more in terms of process. I had just received my hardcover copies a few weeks before the book was going to be published, and I shared one with my mom for the first time. She hadn't read the novel, and I'd wanted to wait until it was really finished product, because I thought she would start copy editing otherwise, but also because I was nervous of what she would think. And there's a mother-daughter relationship at the center of the book that's a difficult one. And she read it over 2 weeks and finished the day before the book was published. And when I spoke to her about it, she told me that she had loved it. And it's very unlike her to say that she likes anything, or I mean, she's usually not as direct. And so just hearing her say that a day before the book was going to be officially published was not just a relief, like it really felt like a balm, and I could just move forward with some confidence. Things would be all right.
Breathe easy.
Yeah.
Yiyun, what about you?
Yes, so I have a good friend. Sometimes, I mean, she actually reads every single word I write. But while I am working on, especially on a novel, in general, I feel cagey. I would not tell her, what I'm working on or what. But there's always a moment I notice. Sometimes it's like 1/3 into the novel or a halfway into the novel. All of a sudden, I just cannot stop sharing a sentence I've written that day or a paragraph. So I start to send her, every time I get so excited, I send her just what I write. Mostly I just want her to praise me. and I always subject lines placeholder. So which means really these things are a placeholder for the book, but I want her to have those moments and like almost like in vivo. At that moment, the novel starts to come alive for me. So I start to send things to her. That's always fun. And I also notice every time it happens, somewhere in the middle of the novel.
I love that. That's your own marker to yourself. And you begin to leave the trail of breadcrumbs.
Exactly.
Gabriella, what about you?
Well, there's so many exciting moments because this was my first book. So just like getting an agent, the book deal, all that was like, oh my God, it was so surprising and exciting. But I think on a more personal level, I get small excitements from sentences where something just happens and I've let go and described, a moment in a really surprising way. I surprise myself. Then I'm like, yes. And that feels really good. So yeah, that's probably when I get most excited.
I love that. Well, it's hard to believe that we are staring down a holiday season here, but if there are just a few books that you love to give as gifts, 1 or 2 sentences about, do you have a book that you love to give as a gift? I would love to hear that because I'm already beginning to think about the holiday season, which seems crazy. But Sanaë, do you have books that you regularly give as gifts? And if so, what are they?
I usually give cookbooks because that's my other passion. But I have to say, and this is maybe not a very exciting answer, but I've been giving Gabriella's book as a gift this summer to so many people, including my mother. And so I think I'm just going to continue doing that until the.
I'm not going to ask you if she liked it or not.
But we will know what she thinks because
right.
Exactly. Gabriella, what about you? Are there books that you love to give to people as gifts?
Book giving is a very personal thing. So I don't have like a book that I give to everyone. I really have to think about the person. Like if it's my sister, it's going to be nonfiction. I'm not going to give her fiction. If it's my partner, I'll probably give him, he likes poetry or if I really loved a fiction book, I might give it to him. But yeah, it's such a personal thing. So I don't have a blanket answer, unfortunately.
No, that's good. It's good to remember that it is a personal thing. Regina, on that, is there a book that you have given as a gift that you felt was really well received, or a book that you love to wrap up for people?
I think Gabriella's right that it is a personal, it's so personal. So I always try to keep the person that I'm giving the gift to in mind. I do know that one year I gave The Known World by Edward P. Jones to everyone. We're going back to Mr. Macpherson because I think he also influenced Mr. McPherson also influenced Edward P. Jones's work. So I just thought it was a masterful book. So yes, that might be the book in the last 10, whenever it came out, that I have given to the most people. Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
I love that. And Yiyun, what about you?
Yeah, there's one novel I love so much. It's an older novel. It's called The Fountain Overflows by Rebecca West. And I've bought many copies of that book. And almost everyone says, I think these I give to friends, and they all say this is the best book I've ever read. Actually, I feel this is the best book I have ever read. I live in that book, so I always get that book as a present.
Oh, I love that. Well, I have to thank all four of you for being a part of this wonderful conversation, and the way you support one another and each other's writing was really just so beautiful to watch unfold on our screen. And you have given us so many recommendations. And for everyone out there who didn't have their pens scribbling fast enough to get all of the amazing books that these authors mentioned, don't worry, because it's been live streamed and recorded, so you can go back and play it at your leisure and write down all of the incredible titles that were mentioned this evening. But thank you, all of you, Gabriella, Yiyun, Sanaë, and Regina, for being a part of this lovely evening. And we're going to celebrate summer until it absolutely leaves us.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.